One of the questions I'm sometimes asked, and certainly a topic that has intrigued me for quite a long time, even since I was a herbal student, is can herbs be a therapeutic source of the mineral silica? The evidence suggests they certainly can, par excellence. And I'd like to take you through this fascinating topic over two presentations. So we're going to talk about silica and health. Is it good to be taking an extra silica? And a particularly interesting phenomenon that silica detoxifies aluminium. Apologies to my US colleagues. I'll be saying aluminium, but you would, of course, say aluminum and spell it slightly differently. And I'll briefly just discuss some issues, not comprehensively, but some issues associated with aluminium and health. And then in part two, I will discuss the surprising amount of research there is on herbs as sources of silica. But I won't leave you hanging. I'll mention the two key herbs I'm going to talk about at the end. And you can see from the diagram, of course, one of them quite obvious, and that is horsetail. So what's silica? It's an element, formed from the element silicon, and silica, which has oxygen in it as well, is one of the most common minerals in the Earth's crust. And as mentioned, it's silicon dioxide. Now, if you find silica in the environment, there are two basic forms: a crystalline version, like sand, for example, and a non-crystalline version that's called amorphous. Now, inhaled crystalline silica can damage the lungs and leads to silicosis. And certainly there's a lot of discussion about how some of these synthetic bench tops that are used in kitchens and the like are leading to silicosis among younger workers, which shouldn't happen. The most common form of crystalline silica is quartz, and of course sand is quartz, beach sand. Non-crystalline silica is found in glass, silicon carbide, and silicone. Now, the impact of an intake of silica on health is controversial, but it's certainly absorbable. Many forms of silicon are water-soluble, especially those forms that are known as silicic and orthosilicic acids, and they're absorbable and potentially bioavailable to humans. However, as mentioned, the specific biochemical or physiological functions of silicon and delivered as silica are largely unproven, although they are generally thought to exist. And that's discussed further in the reference below if you're interested in taking a deeper dive into that. But silicon has been suggested to exhibit roles in the structural integrity of hair, nails, and skin, overall collagen synthesis, bone health, bone mineralization, a reduced metal accumulation in Alzheimer's disease, which I will discuss, and even immune system impact and reduction of the risk for arterial disease, atherosclerosis. And you can see in the image there are many silica products available that, especially at the retail space, are focused on hair, skin, and nails, and so on. So the important point about silica, and the thing that has interested me most over the years, is that silica detoxifies aluminium. And I knew this from my basic organic chemistry days. And it was during the 1990s that investigations showed that silica, in its biologically available form, silicic acid, reduced the gut absorption of aluminium in the diet, firstly, and secondly, facilitated the excretion via the urine of any aluminium that had previously been absorbed. And the chemistry behind this is the interaction of aluminium to form hydroxyaluminosilicates. And that's probably what's happening and can happen under physiological conditions in the body. And it's possible that this particular chemistry might explain the unique influence of silicic acid on both the absorption and urinary excretion of aluminium that I described in the first dot point. So where it gets interesting is that for many, many decades, there has been this aluminium hypothesis for Alzheimer's disease. This aluminium is certainly neurotoxic if it gets into the brain, and very small amounts are needed to cause this neurotoxic effect, and that amount needed is satisfied through dietary aluminium intake. And aluminium can get into the brain. It subverts different transport mechanisms to actively traverse the brain barriers, the blood-brain barrier. And a small amount of aluminium over time favors its selective accumulation in brain tissue. And since 1911, experimental evidence has repeatedly demonstrated that chronic aluminium intoxication produces the neuropathological hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. So this particular review, and it is a controversial area, and there are those that are pro and those that are con, but this particular review said the hypothesis that aluminium significantly contributes to Alzheimer's disease is built upon very solid experimental evidence and shouldn't be discounted. So where it gets interesting first is there's been epidemiological studies that have looked at the amount of silica and aluminium in drinking water and the incidence of dementia. And I picked out this particular review. And in this review, they talk about a study by Rondo and Associates that investigated this phenomenon. And they used their a fairly well-known epidemiological study conducted in France called the PACWID study, and looked at nearly 4,000 people aged 65 years and older who were living in southwest of France. The relative risk of dementia, adjusted for age, gender, and so on, and indeed for wine consumption, was 1.99 for those exposed to aluminium concentrations in drinking water greater than 0.1 milligrams per litre. So literally, that amount of aluminium in the drinking water almost doubled the person's risk of having dementia. In contrast, silicon as silica was preventative, and the relative risk for silicon at 11.25 milligrams per litre in the drinking water was 0.74, which meant that intake of silicon reduced your risk of dementia, or this cohort's risk of dementia, by 26%. So the story doesn't end there. There was this fascinating study that was done in the UK about a decade ago, and it was a group of patients who drank a litre of a silicon-rich mineral water every day for 13 weeks. And the professor involved was Professor Christopher Exley. So what did they find? They backed up this concept that silica, or silicon as silica, can purge aluminium from the body. And he said, we now know that we can use this silicon-rich therapy water to reduce aluminium. But the second part of our research was looking at the cognitive abilities of people with Alzheimer's disease and whether these changed as the aluminium was reduced. And the most interesting thing was that we did see this potential relationship between the removal of aluminium and the positive improvement in cognitive function. And Professor Exley says it's highly unlikely to see changes over such a short period of time. So the fact that we saw changes in cognitive ability was quite a surprise. So the two herbs that I'll be discussing in part 2 will be horsetail and nettle leaf. But just looking at horsetail as a plant for now, before we look at the studies regarding how much you can dose with it and its bioavailability and so on, which will be in part 2, there was this fascinating study that looked at the giant horsetail. And if you look at the images C and D, you can see in those elements, those images, the green fluorescence, and that green fluorescence is silica. So this particular species of horsetail accumulates so much silicon that you can actually see it as an integral component of the cellular structures of the plant. And then there's also been this study which demonstrated that the proteins in horsetail that are acting as silica or silicon transporters are extremely efficient in transporting it and are quite different to what is shown in higher plants. So it's almost a little bit like, with horsetail being such a primitive plant, you know, life on the planet's based on carbon. It's almost like horsetail was having a bet each way, because there is a suggestion in science and science fiction that you can base life also on silicon. And it was perhaps basing itself on both. But it is an extraordinary plant in its capacity, its unique capacity to take up silicon from the soil and store it as a structural element in its cells. And as I mentioned, the other herb I'll be talking about will be nettle leaf. Well, this is nettle stalk. And look at those needles on the nettle stalk. Well, they're actually silica glass. So this plant is so extraordinary that it can extract silica out of the soil, transfer it to the stems and leaves, and then make glass. You know, normally we have big furnaces to make glass, but this plant can make glass out of that silica or silicon that it extracts from the soil. So, you know, I have this thesis that plants are in fact miraculous. And this is one example I use because to me that is totally miraculous. So in part 2, I'll look at some of the clinical research and some of the research associated with how you get the silica out of these herbs and put it into a realistic dosage form. Thank you.